As you may know, I've been working on my own Wii emulator for a few years now, and seeing the weird graphical glitches that happen due to my awful coding is always a treat. Today we're going to talk about two of my absolute favorites: the mystery of why Mario cannot see, and getting to the bottom of what caused these Lumas to get drenched in white. After looking into it in detail, both of these issues might have actually been potential real bugs in the game, but I don't really know that for sure because I don't have access to the actual source code. But whatever the developers were doing was really suspect. So, to figure this out, I spent a few hours trying to figure out exactly how Lumas are rendered, and let me tell you, they are now officially my new favorite thing. The process is genuinely super cool. The first question we should answer is, how did the Lumas even get their color? I mean, there's so many different kinds of Lumas out there. Well, the game does this using something called color levels. Color levels are a way of changing the amount of red, green, and blue applied to a particular model. Take this bland colorless Luma for instance. On the left, we have a graph that shows us how much extra red is added to this Luma, and currently it's at a flat 0. But we can raise it, and the Luma gets much redder. And we can even raise it to the very top, but you can see that doesn't change much since the Luma is already fully saturated with red. I could also choose to remove red, which makes the Luma green and blue, in other words, teal. But we can get much fancier. I can tilt the red line like so, and now we remove red from the dark parts of the Luma and add red to the light parts of the Luma, as shown by the graph. And who said we only have to do this with the red color? We can add a bunch of green if we want. We can do something funky with blue. We can do whatever we want, and you can produce a one-of-a-kind Luma. Anyway, here are the real actual values the game uses for its Lumas. For example, this one produces a deep blue Luma, whereas this one produces a much more yellow Luma. But all of that aside, here's what an actual Luma looks like. I mean, clearly we have a ways to go. The finished Lumas look bright, glossy, shiny. How on earth does that work? To understand this, let's look at a real scene from Super Mario Galaxy. Here we have this absolute freeloader of a Luma, whose entire job is to stand outside the terrace and tell me that this is, in fact, the terrace. Let's hit pause. Pay attention to where the camera currently is. If you focus, you'll see that there's a faint white glow where the camera used to be. It's invisible in the actual game, but it's there. But can a faint white glow really be doing all that heavy lifting? Turns out yes, and in a super cool way. Again, let's take a closer look. Here's what the Luma looks like when bathed solely by this light. You'll notice that the Luma is mostly white, other than on the edges where it's darker, or even some places around the arms. The game then applies this equation to the Luma, turning it almost completely black. Well, how does that work, and why is this useful? Well, let's take a close look at the equation. Light is a variable that is 0 where the Luma's body is completely black, and 1 where the Luma's body is completely white. In order for the equation to be above 0, the variable light must be quite close to 0, in other words, quite dark. And so that's why you see that the Luma is black, other than the places where the Luma used to be dark. So, in effect, we have a transformation that makes the Luma black other than the edges. The game then adds that shine to the output from the color levels, and we already have something that looks quite a bit nicer. It's the same blue Luma from earlier, but shiny. Then, the game tells the GPU, something really silly, just boost the colors by 4, literally. Just multiply all the colors by 4, making the Luma much brighter, and now, we're almost at the finale. The game does one more tiny trick, one more color level, this time the same for all 3 color channels. Red, green, and blue all at the same time. I invite you to pause the video and guess what this color level will do to the Luma. Anyway, are you ready? 3, 2, 1, pow. If you didn't catch it, I don't blame you, it's quite subtle, so I'll put the old Luma at the top. The newer one looks a bit brighter in the dark parts of the graph, and a bit darker in the brighter parts of the graph, which matches exactly what the graph told it to do. Now, which part of all this do you think my emulator messed up? Seems like it would be the most complicated part, right? Well, it turns out my Luma was looking almost perfect up until this very last step. And how does that even make sense? And how does this even relate to the earlier bug of Mario having no eyeballs? Well, to answer those questions, let's examine the graph in more detail. This is the exact equation the game gave me, a polynomial. Except, it didn't. This is what the game actually gave me. A completely different polynomial that is much bigger and just basically catapults the Luma to white. How does this even make sense? What could I be doing wrong? Was the game somehow giving me the wrong value? Or was I interpreting the value incorrectly? I have no idea. Well, turns out what was happening is something really weird about the Wii's hardware. This problematic number, 3.219, is provided to me as an 11-bit binary number. The hardware places a decimal point right here, which gives the binary 8 bits of fraction, which we will color in blue, 2 bits of integer, colored in green, and 1 bit to control the sign. It will be 0 when positive, and 1 when negative. In this case, the sign is 0, representing a positive number, the integer is 11, representing 3, and the fraction is 56, representing 56 over 256, in other words, 0.219. But why does the integer part just go away? What's going on here? I mean, the sign is correct. The decimal is correct. But somehow I have 3 instead of 0. Well, what's happening? Well, in order to understand, we have to figure out how the game gives me the equation. This equation that I've shown you, well, honestly all of them, all the parabolas, all the color levels, everything, they're actually a completely different equation in disguise. It's actually this. This is known as the Wii's TEV equation, T-E-V, TEV. And while this equation is a bit more complicated than this in reality, the simplified version is good enough for our purposes. The game can apply up to 16 TEV equations to the model, and that is what decides the actual color. It can choose any values for A, B, C, D that it wants. It could be textures, colors, lights, anything, even numbers like 3.219. Now I'm going to show you how the game turns the general TEV equation up there into the parabola in red. In this case, the game sets both B and C to X, which is the pixel color of the Luma prior to the parabola being applied. It then sets D to 0, so we can just nuke that part of the equation, and after some simplification, we get this value. The game then sets A to 3.219, and we get the exact parabola from above. But why is this important? Well, in this case, the game provided 3.219 as the value for A, and here's where we get to how weird the documentation for this console is. It neglected to tell me a very important detail. The number the GPU gives me, it is 11 bits, but only if it's provided for D, the variable D. If you provide it for A, B, and C, it's actually 8-bit numbers. The documentation just neglects to mention this. The GPU provides the same mechanism for the game to configure D as it does for A, B, and C, but for A, B, and C, it silently ignores the signed and integer bits, setting them to 0, and treats it as a strictly fractional number. Absolutely bizarre. And so, at this point, I knew I had to emulate the TEV equations with a bit more accuracy towards binary. And after fixing the bug, at long last, the Lumas look beautiful. And wouldn't you know it, it turns out that fixing all this binary stuff actually caused Mario to find his eyeballs again. And the reasoning why is actually quite simple. Let's look at the TEV equation responsible for calculating the transparency of Mario's eyeballs. The game decided to set D to the output from the previous TEV equation, which is unshown because it's such a boring TEV equation, it literally just sets the output to 1. Okay, great. Next, it sets A to 0, nuking the entire left side of the equation, and we're left with this. Well, what are B and C? Well, turns out B is 1/4, and C is the alpha from the texture the eyes use. Alpha meaning the transparency value. Well, here's the texture, and in case you couldn't tell, it's transparent nowhere. It's fully opaque. It's completely 1. The alpha is always 1 everywhere. So we can simplify even further. And then the game uses a TEV feature I didn't actually mention called bias, and it adds a constant 0.5 to the entire thing, giving us a final alpha value of 1.75. which I have no idea how to interpret. It doesn't make any sense. Alpha is supposed to be 0 to 1. 0 meaning fully transparent, 1 meaning fully opaque. This is 1.75. This means that it's even more opaque than opaque? That makes no sense. And then on top of that, the game uses some additional GPU features to say, hey, yo, if the final alpha value is between 0.5 and 1, render the pixel. Otherwise, do not render it. And so, with 1.75, we fail the check and Mario has no eyeballs. Now, some of you might see the connection already and deduce what is happening. It's literally the exact same bug. The output of the TEV equations are supposed to be 8 bits, not 11 bits like I was treating them. And so, emulating the right bit width destroyed the integer part, turning 1.75 to 0.75, and now, at long last, Mario can see once again. And there we have it. I have no idea what the developers were doing here, and while I'm inclined to believe that there's a good reason to go about this the way they did, I think it's genuinely infinitely funnier to pretend that they were trying to jump scare anyone who uses an emulator. Well, that's all for today. I hope you learned a thing or two about how the Wii's GPU renders stuff. Let me know what you thought, and if there's anything in particular you want me to talk about, mention it in the comments, and I'll consider making it into a video. Bye for now.